Yeah, Marvin.
Yes, of course. Thank you all for joining us. I'm honored to succeed Sebastian Cody as the chair of the Global Consortium for Systems Research. Sebastian has served as an advisor to 4 successive director generals at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis over the last 15 years, and has helped shape the 2022 to 2023 10th anniversary strategic plan. It is now available on our website, unbuiltlabs.com/GCSR. We are pleased to welcome our keynote presenter on system science, Jim Ha, Professor of Climate and Environmental Risks and Director of Research at the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. Would you like to present?
Hello, Marvin. Hello, colleagues. I will not be using slides, so we can just leave the camera like that. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here this afternoon in England at least, and to just say a few words on this topic of systems, and in particular how systems are applied in policy, how systems analysis speaks or does not speak in policy and government settings. Let me just begin with a few words about what is understood by a system, in that a focus on a system means a focus on interactions. So not dwelling obsessively from a reductive point of view at the individual entities, and seeking to understand them in all of their detail, but instead looking at how the entities within a system interact with one another, and how those interactions then lead to and help to explain the things that we observe, the properties we observe at a macro scale. And that's the concept of emergent properties of systems, that through complex interactions we see emergent behaviors which are shaping in many different ways the world in which we're living. And the biggest problems that we face are systems problems. If we think about climate change, for example, we recognize vast numbers of interactions, both leading to carbon emissions of other greenhouse gases, but then also how the Earth system responds to those carbon emissions with interactions between the Earth's surfaces, ecosystems, the oceans, the atmosphere, the cryosphere, is all interacting, and in a sense climate is an emergent property of those interactions. And if we just look at the at energy, which is the greatest contributor to carbon emissions, to understand at all how we're going to get carbon emissions down from the way in which we produce and use energy, we need to understand energy as a system. So what are the sources of energy? The majority of them being hydrocarbons at the moment, how those sources transformed. So, for example, how gas is turned into electricity in gas turbines, and then what's the demand and what are the uses of energy. And I've got a Sankey diagram in my mind at the moment. That's one way of approaching the system, which maps out those flows of resources through this system, from supply to demand, or one might actually perhaps more illuminatingly think about it from demand to supply. And then the other thing I have on my mind is a map of the spatial interactions of how that system of energy supply and demand spreads out across our planet, and how, in order to understand it, and how to, in order to, for example, understand the energy crisis which we face at the moment, we need to understand the position of Russia and the countries which consume fossil fuels produced in Russia, how those interact with each other spatially, and what the effect of the shock of conflict on that system has ended up being. And if we're going to decarbonize the power system, that requires a systems view as well. If we just think, for example, about the role of hydrogen in the power system, why would we be interested in hydrogen? In many senses, if you're going to use it to heat your house, it doesn't make much sense at all. One has to electrolyze water, create a hydrogen industry, pump hydrogen around, and then burn it again in your house, when it would make much more sense just to heat your house with electricity. But if one understands all of the multiple potential uses of hydrogen, not just, or indeed not primarily for heating, but as a energy storage medium, as a means of propulsion in ships and possibly aeroplanes, as a industrial feedstock for a number of industries which are difficult to decarbonize, like the steel industry. Then if you put that system together, then you begin to understand the motivation for why hydrogen is such an interesting product. And it's only by understanding things as a system that you can make that case. Let me just say a few brief words about the Sustainable Development Goals, because in many senses they are a system par excellence, in that I'm not saying they're perfect, but they are, in a sense, the best we have of a complete description of what the world collectively has said that it wants. And it's that attempt at completeness which I really love about the SDGs, for all of their flaws. But then as soon as we begin thinking about implementation of the SDGs, again, we begin to see a whole host of interactions that these individual goals and targets can't be taken on attacked on their own. And indeed, we have plenty of opportunities to do multiple beneficial things at the same time by adopting strategies which span across the SDGs and tackle those points of leverage, those points of system intervention where we might have the opportunity for the most benefit. So how does all of that then play into the role of government? And I think the short answer there would be to say with difficulty, in that governments all over the world struggle with coordination problems. They're created as hierarchies. Of course they are. Everywhere has a leader of some shape or form. And from that cascades a hierarchy and almost inevitably a series of silos. And so governments inevitably struggle with systems challenges, and the response, which is coordination across government, is something which I think it would be true to say every government struggles with. And so the first thing I would say about that is not to agonize too much. because this is a challenge which every government faces and is addressing it more or less imperfectly. The second thing is that if you can address a problem in a silo, then why not? That is the by far the easiest way of doing it. Give your silo a target and tell that silo to get on with it. And so in that way, if we can narrow down the number of truly cross-cutting issues that we're dealing with, then that makes the challenge of government a bit easier. The next point to make it then is, if interdependencies are inevitable, and they are, of course, then are the ways in which we can appeal to self-organization whilst having some sense of a problem owner. I think that is needed. But sometimes there's a kind of knee-jerk when a cross-cutting problem is identified to create another cabinet committee with another minister in charge of it. And those things usually run out of steam and then end up getting abolished before long. Whereas if people can be empowered to self-organize their systems problems, maybe they're more enduring. The next point to make, and this is in a sense a classic systems remark, is be open to learning and adaptation. And so recognize that mistakes are going to be made, and create structures which can monitor, can understand what's going on, learn from that monitoring, and can adapt very quickly. And in many governments across the world, the COVID pandemic forced governments to learn and to adapt and to create new ways of working incredibly rapidly, and on many occasions incredibly creatively, actually. I've just been at a government committee meeting today, and the night, many of the officials there the night before had been at a big face-to-face celebration, a party really. COVID-related parties have got a bad reputation in this country, but this was an official one, in which the civil service had brought together hundreds of civil servants who had worked incredibly hard to adapt and change the way in which they work in order to manage with the COVID crisis. And one of the points of discussion is, well, what can we learn from this? What can we build in from the way in which we did adapt in order to address systems problems in a better way in the future? But I think there's also the other kind of sense from that gathering was we don't want to do this again very soon. And unfortunately, we seem to be living in a world where dramatic shocks are happening very frequently, because following COVID, we now have an energy crisis and an accompanying cost of living crisis right the way across the world. But amongst this, we should really put a premium value on stability, because I think a lot of things that I'm talking about are extremely difficult to achieve during turmoil. And so this is a question of balancing that lesson to make mistakes, learn, adapt, sprint from time to time, with a need to value stability within systems. I'm conscious of time, but I just wanted to make two more remarks. One is on the role of system models in their broadest sense, and that includes computer models, and there are many domains in which one wouldn't embark upon a water resource management plan or a energy system decarbonization without a model these days. One needs to be cautious about that role of models, but what do they do? First thing is that they, even though they're all wrong, as we know from George Fox, they give a sense of proportion. They tell you how things add up, and I think that's really important. And they provide a boundary offering around which different actors within a system ideally can congregate and can develop a shared understanding of that system to explore possible futures and scenarios, not to predict the future. I don't think that's possible, but to explore the future and to understand sensitivities and intervention points. The final point I want to make, however, is around alienation versus participation. And a lot of what I'm talking about either turns people off or they find it completely inaccessible, or both. I've been part of my research program has been around developing so-called system of systems models. But I've been told pretty firmly that the terminology system of systems just doesn't work for policymakers, members of the general public. They, for the most part, haven't got a clue what one's getting at. I think we need to be extremely careful about elitism within this context. Think very carefully about how we can make the type of discourse I've just been probably guilty of pitching in a pretty inaccessible way, how we can make that more accessible. And I think a big part of that is around articulation of purpose and of creating narratives around how systems can achieve that purpose for people. And that, I think, is about the best we can do.